The night janitor entered at 2:51 a.m., pushing his cart with the careful quiet of someone who had learned over years of physical work that silence was a form of respect. He didn't slam doors. He didn't let metal scrape against tile. He moved through the 53rd floor of Merrill Tower the way a man moves through a hospital corridor at night, aware that the sounds he makes belong to him alone, and that everyone else is either sleeping or pretending to. Catherine Merrill was pretending. She sat in the leather chair at the head of conference room C spine, straight hands folded in her lap, breathing at the deliberate pace of someone deep in sleep. Her eyes were closed, but her mind was running the same algorithm it ran in every board meeting, every negotiation, every room where something important was being decided without anyone saying so out loud. She was watching. She was measuring. She was waiting to see what kind of man this was when he believed the most powerful person in the building was unconscious and therefore irrelevant. Her father had taught her this. Thomas Merrill, who had built this company from a single-room brokerage on the south side of Chicago into a capital group managing assets across 11 states, had believed that character was not something people showed you. It was something you caught them with. He used to stay late on Friday nights when he was still just a floor manager watching how the junior analysts talked to the cleaning crew. He said it told him everything he needed to know about who they'd become in 20 years. Catherine had inherited the company, the building that bore the family name, and that particular habit of watching. She had been watching Daniel Holt for exactly 14 days, which was how long it had been since Marcus Webb, her head of building security, had mentioned during their weekly briefing that the overnight maintenance employee on floors 47 through 55 had asked questions about the mechanical systems. Specifically, he had asked why certain equipment was running during off hours on floors that were supposed to be unoccupied. Webb had told him it wasn't his concern. Webb had told him to focus on his assigned work. And Daniel Holt, according to Webb's account, had nodded and returned to his cart without another word. But he kept looking at the ceiling vents. Webb had said it almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail a less careful observer would have left out of the briefing entirely. He just kept looking up like he was doing math in his head. Catherine had asked Webb to repeat it. Then she had asked him to pull the employee's file. Then she had dismissed Webb and sat alone in her office for 40 minutes with a folder she couldn't stop reading. The cart wheels stopped outside the glass wall. Through the carefully maintained stillness of her posture, Catherine tracked the reflection in the darkened window across the room, the same trick her father had used, the same geometry of angles that turned glass into a mirror when the interior lights were low enough and the night outside was dark enough. She could see the hallway. She could see the man standing in it. Daniel Holt was 42 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who have done physical labor for 2 decades and then suffered something that broke them look older, not deteriorated but weighted. He was 6 feet tall with the kind of lean build that came from work rather than a gym, dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were visible even from this distance as the hands of someone who had spent years on job sites rather than in offices. His uniform was clean. The Merrill Tower logo on the left chest pocket faded but not frayed, and his shoes had been polished recently. Not the shoes of a man who had given up, but the shoes of a man who understood that dignity was something you maintained on your own terms, regardless of what the job title said. He stood outside Conference Room C for 11 seconds. Catherine counted. He was deciding. She understood this without being able to see his face clearly. She understood it the way she understood negotiating pauses, the way she had learned to read the silence before a counteroffer as either genuine hesitation or tactical theater. This pause was neither. This was a man running a calculation that had nothing to do with risk or reward and everything to do with something she didn't have a clean professional category for. He opened the door. The latch clicked with the precise quietness of someone who had learned how to handle objects without announcing himself. He came into the room moving differently than he had in the hallway, slower each step placed, rather than taken weight distributed evenly, so his work boots made no sound on the commercial carpet. He set the spray bottle down on the cart outside rather than carrying it in. He didn't start with the windows or the conference table or the whiteboard at the far end. He stopped 3 feet from her chair. Catherine kept her breathing even. She had done harder things than this. She heard fabric. The soft, specific sound of a zipper, not a bag, something being removed. Then the weight of it settled across her shoulders, gradual and deliberate, the way you'd cover someone if you were trying not to wake them. A jacket. Denim worn soft from washing, still carrying the warmth of the body that had just been wearing it, carrying the smell of laundry detergent and the faint mineral cold of a Chicago night. What he said next, she would carry for the rest of her life. His voice dropped to something barely above breath, not a whisper so much as the kind of voice you use when you're not really talking to the person in front of you. His words were quiet enough that she almost missed them, but the room was silent enough that she caught every one. "She's cold, Claire. I noticed. I'm here." Then a pause, and something shifted in the texture of the silence. "You're not alone. I promised." Catherine did not move. She did not open her eyes. She controlled her breathing with the iron discipline of someone who had learned in 17 years of boardrooms and closing tables and hostile negotiations how to keep her face from broadcasting what was happening behind it. But something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with professional calculation and everything to do with the recognition of a grief so old it had calcified into architecture, not something the man carried, but something he had been built around, the way a tree grows around a piece of metal embedded in its core. He wasn't talking to her. She had known it before the second sentence. He was talking to someone who was not in this room. Someone to whom he had made a promise that apparently governed what he did at 2:51 in the morning on the 53rd floor of a building where no one was watching him and no one would ever know the difference. He could have pushed his cart past the glass wall, noted the sleeping executive as a complication to return to later, and continued his route. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have cared. The floors would have been equally clean either way. Instead, he had come into the room, removed his own jacket, and covered a stranger. Because he had promised. Daniel moved away from her chair with the same careful quiet and began working the room in the methodical pattern of someone who had developed efficient habits through repetition spray and wipe, along the window line first, then the table surface, then the baseboards, then the whiteboard. He worked around her as though her presence in the chair created a kind of gravity that reorganized the geometry of the space, giving her wide berth, treating the radius around her with a consideration that went beyond professional courtesy into something closer to protectiveness. 18 minutes later, the cart wheels moved back into the hallway. The door closed with the same controlled click it had opened with. Catherine sat with her eyes still closed for another 2 minutes. Then she sat up. The jacket was still across her shoulders. She reached into the left pocket, not because she expected anything, but because she was the kind of person who checked and found a photograph small and bent at one corner. Two people against a backdrop of Maine snow. The kind of photograph you take with a phone when you're not thinking about composition, but only about wanting to keep the moment. A woman with dark hair and a real smile, not a posed smile, but the kind that reaches the eyes before it reaches the mouth, and a girl with those same eyes in a winter hat with a pom-pom jumping in what appeared to be an attempt to catch a snowflake. On the back, in handwriting that was careful and straight, the kind of handwriting someone had taken time to develop, because sloppy writing caused problems on job sites. Claire and Sophie, Christmas 2021. Catherine turned the photograph over again and looked at the woman laughing in the snow. 3 years ago, which meant the woman in this photograph had been alive 3 years ago and was not alive now, and the man who carried this photograph in his jacket pocket was the 42-year-old widower in the employee file that she had read 4 times since Webb put it on her desk. The man who had moved across a Maine job site and spotted a structural defect that the engineer had certified as sound. The man who had reported a gas leak in a Chicago office building and been given a disciplinary note for exceeding his scope of responsibility. The man who at 2:51 in the morning covered strangers with his jacket and made promises to his dead wife. Catherine stood and walked to the window at the far end of the room. Not the window that faced downtown, but the one on the west side that looked down onto the flat mechanical roof of the building's lower section, where the auxiliary systems for floors 47 through 51 sat in orderly rows. HVAC units, power distribution boxes, cooling infrastructure, standard equipment, the kind of thing you looked at and saw exactly what you expected to see. Except there, above one cluster near the northeast corner, a shimmer in the air that was not heat rising from a running system in standby mode. Standby generated a certain thermal signature barely distinguishable from the ambient temperature of a Chicago night in October. What she was looking at generated more. Not dramatically more. Not the kind of thing that would appear obviously wrong to someone who hadn't been told to look, but more. Enough more that a man who spent his nights moving through this building with nothing to do but notice things, a man who had learned to read structural anomalies on job sites because getting it wrong could kill someone, had looked at this same view and heard in the math of heat and electricity and timing something that didn't add up. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus Webb. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the flat alertness of someone who slept with his phone close and didn't complain about late calls because complaining wasn't in his job description. She told him she needed the power consumption reports for floors 47 through 51. 6 months of data. On her desk before 7 a.m. What specifically are you looking for? Discrepancies. Usage that doesn't match occupancy. Systems running on schedules that don't correspond to any authorized work orders. That's a broad parameter, Ms. Merrill. The night janitor noticed something. I want to know what. The pause that followed was half a second long. Possibly nothing. In 17 years of reading pauses, Catherine had learned that the ones that meant nothing felt like nothing. This one had a texture. I'll have the data to you by 6:30, Webb said. She ended the call and stood at the window for another minute, watching the heat shimmer above equipment that was working harder than it should have been in a supposedly unoccupied space, and thought about a man who had come into a room where he thought no one was watching and covered a stranger with his jacket because he had made a promise to someone who couldn't hold him to it anymore. She was at her desk at 6 o'clock. Webb arrived at 6:20 with a folder that was thicker than a standard report, his eyes carrying the specific redness of someone who had been awake long enough for the effort to show. She didn't thank him for it. She opened the folder while he was still standing there. The data required 40 minutes to read properly, which she gave it. Normal fluctuations in a building this size produced a visual noise that could obscure a genuine pattern if you weren't looking for the right shape. She found the shape at the 50-minute mark, not because it was obvious, but because she had been told there was something to find which changed what she was looking for. A recurring spike of 28 to 31% in power consumption across floors 47 through 51, appearing every Tuesday and Thursday night between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. consistent across the past 4 months. Not large enough to trigger the automated threshold alerts which were calibrated for sudden surges rather than sustained increases. Not irregular enough to appear as a malfunction rather than a schedule. Deliberate. Precise. The signature of someone who understood the system well enough to stay below the line that would generate a question. She asked Webb what was on those floors. Floor 48 was auxiliary server space and overflow storage. Floors 49 and 50 were undergoing renovation for the post-merger expansion, active construction during business hours, locked and empty at night. Floor 51 was mechanical and building systems. She asked who had access to those floors after hours. During the day, the contracted renovation crews. At night, building security on routine checks and maintenance. She asked what would produce a 30% power spike in space that was supposed to be empty. Webb's frown was professional, which meant it revealed only what he wanted it to. Running some kind of equipment. Heavy processing climate control for something temperature sensitive. I'd need to do a physical inspection to know for sure. Then Schedule 1. Ms. Merrill, a maintenance worker asking about lights. It isn't about lights. She closed the folder with a finality that ended the sentence for him. It's about someone paying attention to something everyone else is walking past. When was the last time anyone on our operations team walked those floors after hours? When was the last time anyone asked why systems designed for standby mode are running at 30% load in an empty building? Webb had no answer that would help him, so he had the intelligence to produce none. Tonight, she said, after hours, you, me, and a building engineer from outside our regular contract, someone with no connection to our current renovation project. He left. Catherine looked out her window at the Chicago skyline acquiring its morning geometry, all steel and glass, catching the specific gray light of an October dawn, and thought about Grant Waller. Grant was 52 years old and had been her CFO for 9 years. He had been there when she restructured the company's entire investment thesis after the 2018 correction. He had been there when the Hartfield deal nearly fell apart at the closing table, and they had worked back-to-back 36-hour periods to rebuild the financial architecture from the regulatory objections up. He was the person she called when she needed to think out loud the professional relationship that had come closest over the years to something that could also be called a friendship, which in Catherine's life was a category with very few occupants. She had mentioned the power anomalies to him yesterday morning, not as an investigation, just as something she'd noticed. A data point. She had watched his face with the same attention she gave everything, and what she had seen was processing acknowledgement, a verbal response that was technically complete and professionally appropriate. He would look into it. He would follow up. He had not asked why she was looking at power consumption data for floors that were under active renovation management. He had not asked how she had come to notice it. He had not asked the one question that in 9 years of working together, Grant Waller always asked when she flagged something unusual, which was, "What do you think it means?" She had logged that. She had not yet decided what to do with it. The second night came 2 days later. Same room, same chair, same arrangement of posture and stillness. She had told Webb she would stay late again. She had told her assistant Jennifer to hold all calls after 9 and not to expect her before 7 in the morning. She had eaten dinner at her desk and then sat in conference room C in the dark, with the building settling around her and the city glittering below, and waited. Daniel Holt arrived at 2:53 a.m., 2 minutes later than the first time, which was still within any reasonable definition of punctual. He stopped outside the glass wall and she tracked his reflection carefully, watching his face rather than his posture. He looked at the woman in the chair. He stood still for 12 seconds, 1 second longer than the first time. He knew. She was certain of it before he reached for the door handle. Whatever calculation he was running, it had reached a different conclusion than most people would have reached. Most people, recognizing that the same executive was sitting in the same chair in the same position at 3 in the morning for the second time in a week, would have made one of two choices. Either conclude that the woman was genuinely odd and proceed with work, or recognize that something deliberate was happening and stay out of it. Both responses were self-protective. Both responses were what the professional environment at every level from janitor to board member trained people to do. He came in anyway. This time the jacket was a hooded sweatshirt, dark gray, worn soft at the cuffs, the kind that has been washed enough times that it no longer holds its original shape, but instead holds the shape of the person who wears it. He draped it across her shoulders with the same deliberate care as before, and there was no audible pause before he spoke. This time the words came naturally, without the slight hesitation of the first night, as though he had already said them once and knew where they landed. "I know you're probably not cold." Low, almost to himself, facing the room rather than the chair. "But just in case you need someone to notice. I notice. I'm here." Then he moved to the window. Not to clean it, to the far corner, the one with the angle that looked down onto the mechanical roof. He stood there without touching the glass, and in the reflection Catherine could see his face clearly for the first time, and what she saw was not the expression of a man looking for something suspicious or dramatic. It was the focused, practical look of a man doing math. A carpenter checking a measurement, a structural worker reading a load-bearing diagram. Third time this week. His voice was almost inaudible, clearly intended for no audience. Tuesday, Thursday, tonight, same load signature, same duration window, about 5 hours each cycle. That's not a malfunction, that's a schedule. Somebody is running something in there on a schedule. A pause. And the camera in that hallway doesn't move. Hasn't moved in 7 months. Every other camera on this floor has variable sweep. That one just stares at the wall. He turned from the window and resumed his work. Catherine did not move for the full 18 minutes of his circuit. When the cartwheels receded down the hallway, she counted to 90 before rising from the chair. She crossed to the window where he had stood and looked down at the mechanical cluster he had been studying, and what she registered was not the heat shimmer this time, she'd already cataloged that, but rather a specific camera mounted above the emergency exit on the northeast stairwell. She had passed it hundreds of times. She had never noticed that its field of view ended approximately 30 feet short of the north side HVAC access corridor, a fixed camera with a permanent blind spot. She called Webb again. Same hour, same clipped exchange. This time she didn't ask for data. She told him to pull the service history on that specific camera model number, installation date, contractor, any modifications. She wanted it before the evening inspection she had already ordered. "I'll have it to you by noon." And Webb, who authorized the camera upgrade project 7 months ago, the whole floor installation on 47 through 55. Another pause, this one longer. That would have been Mr. Voss as part of his oversight of the building infrastructure improvements tied to the renovation project. She thanked him and ended the call. By noon she had 2 things on her desk. The power consumption report she already knew, and the camera service history which told her that the unit above the northeast stairwell had been installed in the upgrade 7 months ago, had never been repositioned despite 3 routine maintenance visits, and had been signed off on as correctly positioned per installation specifications by a technician whose paperwork bore Richard Voss's authorization signature. Richard Voss was 48 years old and had been her chief operating officer for 3 years. He was organized, efficient, and had managed the Crestview financial due diligence workstream with what she had characterized to the board as exceptional operational discipline. He had been responsible for coordinating the renovation of floors 49 and 50 for the post-merger expansion that the Crestview acquisition would fund. He had unrestricted access to those floors. He had the authority to authorize access logs and contractor credentials. He had signed off on a camera installation that left a specific corridor with no coverage. She did not go to Grant with this. She sat with that decision for most of the afternoon, not the investigation itself, but the withholding. Grant was her CFO. The Crestview deal was a financial transaction. Any anomalies in the due diligence process were structurally his domain as much as hers. In 9 years, she had never conducted a significant internal inquiry without looping him in at the discovery phase. She didn't loop him in. She told herself it was because she had nothing concrete yet, only pattern and inference. She told herself she would bring him in once the physical inspection confirmed something worth confirming. She told herself these things the way her father had told her. People told themselves things, not lying exactly but not looking directly at the question that was trying to form in the back of her mind, the one she wasn't ready to examine. At 11 p.m., she met Webb in the lobby of the 48th floor with a building engineer named Frank Caldera, whom she had engaged through a firm that had no existing contract with Merrill Capital and no relationship with Richard Voss or the renovation project. Caldera was 55, ex-commercial construction, and had the specific kind of unhurried competence that came from 20 years of looking at the things inside walls and ceilings that nobody saw until something went wrong. The auxiliary server room on 48 hit them with a wall of warmth the moment Caldera opened the door. Not dangerous, not the radiant heat of a system in distress, but the sustained warmth of hardware running at significant load for an extended period. Caldera moved to the monitoring station and had the system data on screen in under 3 minutes. His voice was flat and technical when he delivered the finding, the voice of someone reporting what the instrument said rather than editorializing. Distributed processing. Multiple nodes running coordinated computation. This isn't backup or archival function. Somebody is running active workloads on this hardware, and they've been doing it long enough that the cooling infrastructure is at sustained capacity, trying to keep up. What kind of workloads? Catherine asked. Based on resource allocation patterns, modeling, or simulation. Something that needs this level of processing power and can't use the primary systems for whatever reason. I'd need access to the actual processes to tell you more. Webb was checking access logs on his tablet. According to system records, the last authorized entry into this room was a routine maintenance check 3 weeks ago. Then someone has access that isn't in the system, Catherine said. She moved to the door. Let's keep going. 49 was construction zone as expected. Materials stage tools locked the particular arrested energy of a renovation in progress. Caldera noted 2 items that were minor but technically non-compliant with city building code as applied to active work sites. the kind of things that accumulated when a project was large enough that individual supervisors lost track of specifics. Catherine filed them without comment. At the north end of the floor, behind a wall of plastic sheeting marked with the orange and black tape that designated a demolition staging area, there was a steel door. It was not on the renovation schematic that Webb pulled up on his tablet. It was not in the building's infrastructure records for this floor, which should have logged any permanent installation added during the renovation. It was mounted in what was, according to the original floor plan, a structural wall, a wall that was not supposed to have a door in it. The door was steel commercial grade with an electronic lock that was self-contained and battery-powered rather than connected to Merrill Tower's central access control system, a camera that saw nothing, a door that wasn't in the records, a lock that reported to no one. Catherine looked at Webb. He produced a compact bypass tool from his security kit, the kind of device that building security kept for legitimate emergency access needs, and worked the lock for 90 seconds before it disengaged with a clean, heavy click. The room on the other side was approximately 14 feet square. It had been converted with clear intent and some investment of effort, a proper work desk rather than a folding table, a workstation with dual monitors, a small commercial-grade refrigerator, and a cot with a pillow that had been recently used. The desk surface held 2 coffee cups, a phone charging cable, and a legal pad with handwriting on the top 3 pages. The monitors were on screensaver, and the screensaver was the logo of Pinnacle Holdings. Caldera stayed in the doorway. Webb moved to the workstation. Catherine went directly to the desk. The legal pad contained calculations, financial projections, clearly the kind of shorthand working notes that people made when they were running models and needed to track assumptions in a format faster than a spreadsheet. She recognized the structure. She had seen it in the Crestview due diligence materials because her CFO's team used this exact notation for working through asset valuation. The numbers on the pad were not the numbers in the official Crestview analysis that her board had reviewed. They were higher, systematically, consistently, specifically higher in the categories that governed the ultimate purchase price recommendation. Webb had the desk drawer open and was working through its contents with the focused attention of someone cataloging evidence before it could be touched or moved. He held up a folder. Inside, printed copies of internal Merrill Capital communications about the Crestview acquisition, emails between senior executives, strategy memos, documents that were marked confidential and should have existed only on secured internal servers, printed and stored in an unlocked filing folder in a hidden room in a construction zone. "This is the full negotiating position," Webb said. His voice had gone carefully flat, the voice of a professional who understood what he was looking at and was keeping his response in the appropriate register. Timeline, pricing, floorboard approval thresholds, conditions for walkaway. Everything Crestview's counterpart would need to know to structure a competing position. The room was quiet enough that Catherine could hear the HVAC system in the ceiling running, she noted, at a level consistent with maintaining a controlled temperature for equipment that generated heat. Someone had modified the climate controls in this room to support sustained hardware operation. A message arrived on her phone. Unknown number sent from what the carrier routing indicated was a temporary account that would likely be deregistered before she finished reading it. 5 words. "Stop the inspection. You don't know." She showed the screen to Webb without comment. He looked at it. "That means someone knows we're here, tonight, right now. Or knows we were coming. Those aren't the same thing." She looked around the room one more time. The coffee cups, the cot, the logo on the screensaver, the folder of things that should never have been printed and carried to an unlocked room in a construction zone. "Photograph everything. Every document, every surface, every cable. I want it done before anyone else enters this room." She stepped back into the hallway and stood in the construction zone, dark with the plastic sheeting moving slightly in the building's air circulation, and thought about a cot that had been used recently. Someone had been sleeping here. Someone with access to everything. Every email, every strategy document, every number in the deal had been working in this room on hardware connected to Pinnacle Holdings, and sleeping on a cot behind a steel door that wasn't in the building's records. She thought about Grant Waller not asking what she thought it meant. She thought about Richard Voss and his authorization signature on a camera installation that left this hallway without coverage. She thought about a man who had stood at a window on the 53rd floor and told a dead woman he noticed because he had promised he would always notice. And she thought about all the things that were true in her building right now that she had not permitted herself to see clearly, because seeing them would have required looking directly at people she had decided years ago to trust. Her father's voice, which she carried the way people carry the voices of the dead, not as memory exactly, but as permanent resident, said what it always said when she tried to avoid a conclusion: she'd already reached the company as only worth keeping if you can look at it clearly. She had not been looking at it clearly. She had been looking at it the way she wanted it to be, which was the one luxury a CEO of a company that managed other people's money and employed 3,000 people and carried her family name on its building simply could not afford. She went back into the hidden room and stood beside Webb while he photographed the folder contents page by page, and she called James Whitmore at midnight because James was 71 years old and had been on this board since before she had joined the company and had seen things that she hadn't seen yet, and because she needed, before she did anything else, to talk to someone who had earned the right to tell her she was wrong, if she was wrong. He answered on the second ring. She gave him the essentials in 4 sentences. He was quiet for a moment. "Come to my office at 7 a.m., he said. "Bring whatever Webb photographed. And Catherine, don't tell Grant before you talk to me." She didn't ask him why. She already knew why, and the knowing of it was the thing she had been keeping at arm's length all day, the thing that lived in the pause before Grant said he would look into it in the 9 years of trust she had extended without ever revisiting the terms. She stood in a hidden room in her own building at midnight while her security chief photographed evidence of what appeared to be a massive fraud at the center of the most important transaction her company had undertaken in a decade. And the feeling in her chest was not the clean operational clarity she brought to problems she had been trained to solve. It was the specific, complicated weight of someone who had just realized that the thing she was looking at had been visible all along, that the blind spots weren't in the camera system. They were in her. She had built a company on reading people. She had read everyone. Everyone except the people she had decided at some point were already known, quantities already understood, already vetted, already trusted. She had not read them because she had not wanted to find something she would have to act on. A man who cleaned floors for a living had stood at a window and read a heat signature in the dark and said simply that somebody was running something on a schedule and the camera didn't move. He had no reason to follow up on it. He had no professional incentive to pursue it. He had no career advancement tied to being right and no consequence for walking past it and deciding it wasn't his business. He had pursued it anyway, quietly, night after night, with the patient attention of someone who had made a promise about what it meant to truly notice things. She had never made a formal promise. She had just assumed that being smart and careful and capable was the same thing as seeing clearly. It was not the same thing. She walked to the window at the far end of the construction floor, this one looking south toward the lake, toward the particular darkness of open water at midnight, when the city lights ended at the shoreline, and stood there for a moment that had nothing to do with planning or calculation. She was not thinking about board meetings or share prices or the conversation she would need to have with Voss tomorrow or the question of Grant that she still wasn't ready to open all the way. She was thinking about a woman in a Maine winter photograph who had died 3 years ago on a night her husband didn't answer the phone, about a promise made at a graveside that had produced in the years since a man who covered strangers with his jacket at 3 in the morning and stood at windows reading the thermal signatures of fraudulent power consumption because he had decided that noticing things, all things, the cold stranger and the running system and the camera that never moved, was what the promise required. She reached into her jacket pocket for her phone to call James back with the floor number and the door code for the morning, and found still there from where she had put it after the first night the small photograph with the bent corner. She looked at the woman laughing in the Christmas snow. The math, she thought. He was doing the math. And he was right. The USB drive sat on the center of Catherine's desk like a small, unremarkable object that had no business being as heavy as it felt. She had placed it there at 6:45 in the morning before Jennifer arrived, before the building had fully pressurized itself with the day's population of analysts and associates and executives who carried their ambitions through the lobby turnstiles every morning with the confident forward lean of people who believed they understood the institution they were entering. The drive's label was printed in the clean sans serif font of someone who used labels as an organizational tool rather than an afterthought. 3 characters, A/2 more, GW/RV, draft 3. She had been looking at it for 20 minutes when Grant knocked. He came in with his usual precise Tuesday morning energy jacket, buttoned, coffee in hand, the particular focused composure of a man who had spent 9 years solving problems before most people identified them as problems. He was 52 and looked it in the way that competent, driven men of that age looked it, which was to say that the years had added authority rather than simply weight. He had a good face for finance, steady, readable on the surface, not given to unnecessary expression. Catherine had always considered this an asset. She was reconsidering what she considered. He saw the drive. He didn't stop moving, didn't change the angle of his approach, didn't do anything so obvious as freeze. But the adjustment was there, a fractional recalibration in the set of his shoulders, the way a man shifts his footing when he registers a change in the terrain he's walking across. 9 years of working alongside someone taught you to read the small print. She let him sit down. She let him take a sip of his coffee. She let the silence extend past the point of comfortable and into the range where it became its own kind of question. "Where did you find it?" His voice was level, which told her he had spent part of last night deciding how to hold himself if this moment arrived. "In an office that Richard Voss built inside this building without reporting it. Behind a steel door that isn't in the building's records, on a floor he controlled with your initials on the file." He looked at the drive for a long moment, not at her at the drive. The difference mattered. Looking at her would have been defensive or combative, the body language of someone preparing an argument. Looking at the drive was the posture of a man confronting something that had existed in the abstract and was now undeniably physical. "How far have you gone into it?" "Far enough to know Voss didn't architect this alone, not with your methodology on the foundation and your initials on the working file." The coffee cup went down with a controlled precision that was in its own way more revealing than anything he'd said. Controlled precision was Grant's default mode. What it meant this morning, applied to the act of setting down a cup, was that he was working very hard to keep his default mode intact. What came out then was not a denial. It was something more complicated, and she would think later more honest than a denial would have been. He had developed a financial modeling approach, an aggressive but defensible framework for asset valuation that pushed at the boundaries of standard methodology without, as he had characterized it to himself, crossing into territory that would constitute misrepresentation. He had used it on a previous transaction where the underlying assets had performed well enough that the gap between the model's assumptions and eventual reality had closed before anyone looked carefully. He had considered it at the time a technical tool. Sharp, yes. Bending, perhaps. Not breaking. Voss had taken the framework 14 months ago and done what Voss apparently did with tools that bent. He had bent them further past the point where they could be characterized as aggressive rather than fraudulent, adjusting the Crestview valuations systematically and specifically in the categories that most directly governed the final purchase price recommendation to the board. $340 million of difference between what the numbers said and what the underlying assets were actually worth. Grant had seen the drift 4 months ago. He had recognized what was happening. He had said nothing. "I told myself the gap would close," he said, and the flatness in his voice was the flatness of a man who had rehearsed a sentence enough times that it had gone dead. That Crestview's core business would perform well enough that the overpayment would correct itself over time, that I could find a way to quietly restate after the deal closed before anyone ran a comparative analysis against the due diligence projections. "You were going to tell me after we spent $2.8 billion on a company we'd overpaid for by $340 million. I was going to find a way to fix it without—" He stopped, started again with less certainty in the framing. "Without it becoming what it's becoming." Catherine looked at him with the full attention she usually reserved for closing tables and hostile depositions. Not anger, she was past anger, which was an emotion for situations that still had momentum in an unfavorable direction. This situation had already detonated. What she felt instead was the particular exhausting clarity that arrived when you finally looked directly at the thing you had been carefully not quite looking at. You didn't break it, Grant. You just didn't stop someone else from breaking it while you were close enough to matter. He didn't answer. There was nothing that would have helped him to say. She told him what cooperation would look like. Every conversation with Voss, every document he had seen or modified or been shown, every person he knew to be involved, which he said was 2-1 in accounting, who had helped conceal the shell company payment trail, and one on Crestview's side, who had been feeding Voss internal financial data in exchange for a piece of whatever Pinnacle Holdings would pay when the hostile takeover launched. She told him she would go to the prosecutors and characterize his cooperation as voluntary and comprehensive, which was the most she could honestly offer and the most he was in any position to negotiate for. She told him she needed his signature on a written account of his knowledge and its timeline before the end of the day. He signed it at 3:15 in the afternoon. She had already called James. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 the next morning before the markets opened in the main conference room on the 53rd floor, the same floor 2 doors down from the room where she had spent 2 consecutive nights pretending to sleep, while a maintenance worker taught her something about what it actually meant to pay attention. 17 people at the table, most of whom had come in from their respective Tuesday mornings, wearing the specific expression of board members summoned to a meeting that had been called in under 18 hours, which was the expression of people who already understood that whatever they were about to hear was going to cost them something before they knew what it was. She presented everything without softening the sequencing. The power data first because it was objective and documentable and established that there was something real to investigate before she introduced the elements that required interpretation. Then the hidden room, the hardware, the Pinnacle Holdings screensaver, the folder of internal communications that should not have existed in printed form in an unlocked filing cabinet behind a door that wasn't in the building's records. Then the financial documents, the working draft with the inflated valuations, the systematic methodology, the $340 million gap between the number the board had approved and the number that corresponded to what Crestview Financial was actually worth. Then Grant's signed account of his knowledge and its timeline. Then the camera installation records and Voss's authorization signature on the blind spot configuration. The room erupted in the specific way that rooms full of intelligent, high-stakes people erupted when presented with information that was simultaneously professionally catastrophic and professionally undeniable, not chaos exactly, but the compressed, overlapping energy of 17 people trying to simultaneously process implications and establish positions and ask questions and reassess everything they thought they knew about a transaction they had been preparing to vote final approval on in less than 3 weeks. Voss sat at the far end of the table in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and looked at her with the calibrated composure of someone who had prepared for this specific room. "This is a significant overreach," his voice carrying the tone of a man who still believed he could control the temperature of the conversation. "You're presenting working documents from a private analysis I was conducting as evidence of fraud. The room in question was a secured workspace within a project I was managing. The camera configuration was a technical decision made by the installation contractor within the parameters of the upgrade specifications I approved." "With your corporate access credentials on the lock," Catherine replied, and her voice was flat in a way that required more discipline than volume would have. "With Pinnacle Holdings active on the workstation, with printed copies of our full negotiating position, pricing floor walkaway conditions, board approval thresholds, in a filing folder that any person entering that room could photograph and transmit in 4 minutes. I want my attorney present before this continues." James Whitmore, from his position at the chairman's seat, delivered the response with the blunt brevity of a man who had been in enough serious rooms to know when brevity was the appropriate instrument. "He's on his way. So is the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. In the meantime, the board is going to hear the rest of Ms. Merrill's presentation, and you're going to remain in this room." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms went quiet when a 71-year-old man with 4 decades of board experience said something in that exact tone. Voss stayed. Catherine completed the presentation. She watched faces the thing she was best at, the skill that had served her more reliably than any financial model or strategic framework she had ever learned, and what she saw was the board dividing, not along the lines she had expected, but along a more fundamental axis. The people who were angry at Voss were angry in the clean, outward-directed way of people whose investment in the transaction was primarily institutional. The people who were angry at her were angry in the turned, inward, calculating way of people whose investment was personal. People who had trusted the CFO, trusted the due diligence process, trusted the architecture of decision-making that should have caught this before it reached a board presentation, and who were now trying to determine whether their anger was better directed at the man who had committed the fraud or the woman who had exposed it in a way that guaranteed a public reckoning. Sandra Kemp spoke from the third chair on the left, her voice carrying the particular precision of someone choosing each word as a legal instrument. "You're recommending we cancel a $2.8 billion acquisition and accept the share price consequences, the investor relations consequences, the regulatory scrutiny that comes with a public fraud disclosure based on a chain of events that began with an overnight maintenance employee asking about power consumption. Based on a chain of events that confirmed what the maintenance employee noticed was worth investigating, yes. You could have conducted the investigation quietly, brought it to this board privately, explored whether there was a path to completing the transaction with corrected financials and appropriate remediation. There's no remediation path that doesn't involve us completing a transaction we now know was built on manipulated projections, which makes completing it securities fraud. There's no quiet version of this. The moment we knew, we became responsible for what we did with the knowledge." Sandra's expression held the particular tightness of someone who was not wrong about the costs and was trying to determine whether being right about the costs made you right about the decision. You're asking 3,000 employees to absorb the consequences of a choice that bypassed normal governance channels. You made unilateral decisions about a $2.8 billion transaction based on your personal judgment, and now you're presenting this board with a fait accompli rather than a genuine choice. Catherine looked at her steadily. The genuine choice was made the moment someone in this building decided to manipulate the numbers. My job was to find out that it happened and make sure this board had accurate information before it voted on a transaction that had been built on false foundations. That's not bypassing governance. That's what governance is supposed to produce. The vote to cancel the Crestview acquisition and authorize full cooperation with federal investigators passed at 10-7. Not a mandate, a warning dressed as a decision. Voss was escorted from the building by Webb and a federal agent at 11:45 in the morning. He walked through the lobby with his attorney on his left and his composure intact, which was the composure of a man who had prepared for this contingency and had decided that the version of himself most likely to survive the next several years was the version that appeared unrattled. People in the lobby watched without staring, which was the Chicago professionals' version of watching intently. By noon, the Merrill Capital share price had dropped 14%. By 3 o'clock, it was 21 below the previous close. Catherine's phone held 47 unread messages from numbers she recognized as institutional investors, journalists, board members outside the meeting, and one from her brother Thomas that she read once and did not respond to. Thomas's message was 3 sentences. He had heard about the investigation. He wanted to discuss his concerns about the company's direction. He had been in conversation with Richard Voss about the post-merger operational structure and believed she should have consulted the family stakeholders before making unilateral decisions of this magnitude. She put the phone face down and looked at her window instead. Her brother had been in conversation with Richard Voss about the post-merger operational structure, the merger that was now canceled, the fraud that was now federal, the man who was now walking to a car with an attorney while the stock price bled. Her brother, who had never forgiven her for being the one their father had chosen to run the company, who had contested the succession process twice in the years after Thomas Sr.'s death, and lost both times through procedures he considered rigged by Catherine's existing relationships with the board. Her brother, who had once told her in a moment of unguarded honesty that he didn't want to run the company, he just didn't want her to run it. She filed the information in the same folder where she filed other things she needed to examine later when the immediate structure of the crisis had been addressed. Then she called Webb, who confirmed that Grant Waller had been cooperative throughout his interview with the federal investigators and had provided the names of the 2 accounting department employees involved in concealing the shell company payments. Both had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The Crestview counterpart, a deputy CFO named Randall Pierce, who had been feeding Voss internal financial data in exchange for a promised stake in whatever Pinnacle would pay, had retained counsel and was in preliminary discussions about a cooperation agreement. The picture was becoming complete in the way that financial fraud pictures became complete not all at once but incrementally, each new fact adjusting the frame slightly until the image it produced was legible. Voss had spent 14 months building the architecture of this. He had the patience of someone who thought in years rather than quarters, which was Catherine reflected exactly the kind of patience that institutional trust made possible. You couldn't build something like this without access, and access required trust. And trust was something that organizations extended to people who gave them no reason to look carefully. Voss had given them no reason to look carefully because he understood that the best concealment was not hiding, but performing normalcy well enough that scrutiny never started. It had been Daniel Holt sleeping 5 hours a night in a Queens apartment in a borrowed jacket who ended up making the mistake of looking. She realized she had been calling it Pilsen in her mind, the Chicago neighborhood, not Queens. He lived in Pilsen. She was letting the day's chaos blur the edges of things she knew precisely, which was a sign that she needed to stop performing executive composure for a few hours and sit with a person who wasn't connected to any of this by consequence or obligation. She called him at 4:15. He answered after 3 rings, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had been awake since the previous night's shift and was operating on insufficient sleep but wasn't going to mention it. She asked if she could come to the park. Not his office, which he didn't have yet. Not her building. The park in Pilsen where she had met Sophie 2 weeks before the investigation broke open. "Sophie's with the neighbor until 6, he said. "I can be there in 20 minutes. She took her car rather than a service, which was the choice of someone who needed 20 minutes of being neither observed nor responsible for anyone else's navigation of the city. Chicago in late October moved through its afternoon rhythms with the particular energy of a city that understood cold was coming and was making the most of the interim food carts still running, people walking faster than they would in summer, but not yet with the insular forward lean of winter. She drove through Pilsen with its murals and 3 flats and corner establishments that had been serving the same neighborhood for 40 years, and the contrast with the glass and steel of her morning felt less like a shift in geography than a shift in register from the language of managed abstraction to the language of things that were simply what they were. He was already on a bench near the climbing structure when she arrived, wearing a jacket that was not the denim one she had returned and not the gray hoodie, something newer, which she suspected he had bought for the board interviews that were coming and had worn today because it was the right temperature for sitting outside in late October. He stood when he saw her, which was a habit rather than a performance, the automatic courtesy of a man whose working life had required a certain physical responsiveness to the presence of others. She sat beside him without preamble. "The CFO knew," she said. Not the same way Voss knew he didn't build it, but he saw the drift 4 months ago and stayed quiet because the deal was too important, and he convinced himself the gap would close before anyone looked. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of boys on the monkey bars negotiate some disagreement about sequencing that appeared to be governed by rules only they fully understood. "How long had you been working with him?" 9 years. "And you didn't see it?" It wasn't an accusation. It was just the shape of the thing stated plainly the way he would state a load-bearing calculation or a structural anomaly, not with judgment, but with the exactness of someone who understood that naming things correctly was the first step in dealing with them properly. She could have defended herself. She could have explained the 9 years of evidence that had made Grant's trustworthiness seem like a settled question rather than a question that remained open. She didn't. "My father told me something before he died," she said instead. "He said I was good at reading people, but I didn't want to read myself." She looked at the boys on the climbing structure who had resolved their disagreement and were now moving in synchronized sequence like a small, efficient machine. "I thought he meant I was arrogant. I spent 4 years thinking that was what he meant. This morning I understood what he actually meant." Daniel waited. I chose not to look clearly at the people I'd already decided to trust. Because once I'd made the decision to trust someone, revisiting it felt like a failure of judgment rather than an exercise of it. Grant fit the shape of what I needed him to be, so I stopped actually looking at him and started seeing the shape instead. "That's not arrogance," Daniel said. "That's just the thing we all do with the people we decide we know." It cost this company $340 million of exposure and a $2.8 billion transaction and a 21% drop in share price in a single afternoon. Yes. He didn't soften it. She had not asked him to. But you stopped it before the deal closed. That matters. She told him what she was planning to announce publicly the next morning: the cancellation, the full disclosure, the cooperation with federal investigators. She told him about the board vote, the 10-7, the arithmetic of how much support she did and did not have. She told him about Sandra Kemp's argument, which was not wrong about the costs, and about the question of whether she had bypassed governance channels in a way that she would spend the next several months defending to people who were not wrong to raise the question even if they were wrong about the answer. Then she told him what she wanted to build from this. Not a response to the crisis, a structural change. A position that didn't exist in the company's current org chart, reporting directly to the board, rather than through her, with unrestricted access to the physical infrastructure of the building and the operational systems that ran beneath the level of financial reporting. Someone whose job was not to understand the numbers, but to notice when the numbers didn't correspond to what was physically true. Daniel looked at her with the careful, unhurried attention of someone running a different kind of calculation than the one she was used to. "You're describing a position designed to do what I was doing for free. I'm describing a position designed to do what you were doing for free with authority instead of a mop." A group of children ran past the bench in some game that had no apparent rules except velocity and noise. He watched them pass. "I'm not qualified for that role, not by anything on paper. Your methodology is don't rationalize away things that don't match. Don't accept convenient explanations just because challenging them is uncomfortable. Don't walk past something wrong because looking at it directly will cause problems for people you work for." She turned to face him directly for the first time since she had sat down. "Tell me which person in my building with the right credentials and the right experience demonstrated that methodology in the last 14 months while this was being built inside my walls." He didn't answer, which was the honest answer. The people I've been relying on to keep this company safe learned somewhere in their careers when to stop asking questions. That's not a character flaw. It's what professional environments teach people to do. It's adaptive until it isn't. She paused. "You apparently never learned it. It cost me 2 jobs. It saved this company." He looked out at the park for a long moment, at the specific, ordinary life of a Chicago afternoon in October, parents and children and coffee cups, and the particular light of a sun that was getting lower earlier than it had a month ago. "If I do this," he said slowly, "I'm going to find things you don't want to find. I'm going to ask questions that make powerful people uncomfortable. And I'm not going to stop because it becomes inconvenient. I'm counting on it. Even if what I find involves you." She held his gaze. "Especially then. Because that's when it matters most, when the easy choice is to declare victory and stop looking." He turned that over for a while. She let him. "My daughter asked me this morning why I was getting dressed up to go downtown," he said finally, his voice finding a different register, quieter, carrying something that the professional conversation hadn't needed to carry. "I told her I was going to talk to someone about a different kind of job. She asked if it meant I was going to stop being her dad." He paused. "She's 8. She's seen too many things change in ways that weren't explained to her first." Catherine thought about a 6-year-old holding her father's hand outside a shelter in Maine because she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. About a photograph that a grown man still carried in his jacket pocket 3 years later. About what it cost to keep a promise when the world had given you every reason to renegotiate its terms. "What did you tell her?" "I told her new jobs change what you do during the day, not who you are or what matters to you. That promises stay the same even when everything else changes." "Does she believe that—" "She will if I keep proving it." He met her eyes. "That's the part that's not negotiable. If I take this on, it has to be something that honors what the promise requires, not something that bends it for professional convenience. I can't become someone who learns when to stop asking questions. If that's what this position turns into, if the pressure builds and the expectation becomes that I find acceptable problems instead of real ones, then I'm not the right person. I can't make problems not exist, she said, and the honesty of it required no additional framing. I can promise to support you in finding them even when it costs me politically. Even when Sandra Kemp uses what you discover to argue that I created a destabilizing element in the organization. Even when board members call and tell me your last report caused an investor relations problem, she paused. And I can promise that I won't ask you to look the other way because the truth is inconvenient. I've spent enough of this year learning what that particular cost looks like. He thought about it the way he thought about everything she had observed, without performance, without the social convention of appearing to deliberate while actually having already decided. Genuine consideration, the kind that took the time it actually took. All right, he said. I'll do the interview. I'll face the committee. She called James Whitmore from the bench while Daniel sat beside her, and Sophie's school buses began their afternoon return through the neighborhood streets. James answered on the second ring, and she told him to convene the hiring committee and draft the position description and expect her formal proposal by morning. She told him the candidate and watched James absorb a silence that lasted long enough to be substantive. The board's confidence vote is going to be close, James said. Adding this on top of the cancellation announcement is going to give Sandra additional arguments. I know. You're staking a significant amount of your remaining political capital on a person you've known for 3 weeks. I'm staking it on what I observed for 3 weeks, which is a different thing. She looked at Daniel, who was watching a pair of sparrows dispute ownership of a pretzel fragment with the same patient attention he gave everything. The person I've known for 9 years is currently cooperating with a federal investigation after concealing knowledge of securities fraud for 4 months. My track record on established trust is not unimpeachable, James. A short sound from James that might have been a reluctant acknowledgement of something he didn't disagree with. I'll have the committee ready by Thursday. The night the board voted 10-7 to cancel the acquisition and initiate federal cooperation. Catherine stayed in her office until 11, working through the press statement with a deliberateness that rejected every softening her communications team proposed. She wanted the language plain. She wanted it to say what had happened without the euphemistic wrapping that institutional crisis communications use to tell the truth while making it as uninformative as possible. The final statement was 4 sentences and said in substance that Merrill Capital had discovered internal fraud in its due diligence process for the Crestview acquisition, had canceled the transaction to protect its clients and shareholders, was cooperating fully with federal investigators, and was committed to the structural changes necessary to prevent recurrence. She released it at midnight, and then sat alone for a while with the lights dimmed and the city doing its late-night thing outside the window, and thought about her father, which was something she did when she had done something large enough that she needed to run it past someone whose judgment she trusted completely and who was no longer available for consultation. Thomas Merrill Sr. had died at 67 of a sudden cardiac event in this building, in an office 4 floors below where she was sitting now. He had been reviewing quarterly reports at 6 in the evening on a Thursday, which was typical. He had not suffered visibly or called for help, which was also, she had come to understand, typical of him in a way she had not fully grasped while he was alive, a man who had learned over a lifetime of building things in an environment that rewarded self-sufficiency, that asking for help was a kind of admission that he was not sure he could afford. She had inherited that along with the company and the building and the habit of watching people when they thought no one was watching. What she had not inherited or had inherited and then professionally trained herself out of was the willingness to be uncertain in front of other people. Thomas Sr. had been certain in public and uncertain in private, which she had always interpreted as discipline, but was beginning to understand might also have been a form of the same thing she had done with Grant, a refusal to look directly at the question of whether the certainty was real. The fire alarm on floor 49 activated at 9:47. She registered the sound, the building's emergency system running its escalating tone through the overhead speakers, and was already moving before the security desk called her cell. Webb's voice was controlled in the way that required effort rather than ease. Small fire floor 49, possibly electrical fire department en route, building evacuation protocol activated. And then, before she could ask the question, someone entered the north side construction area approximately 25 minutes ago. The hallway camera still doesn't have coverage, we don't have footage. But the stairwell camera on 48 caught someone coming out of the freight elevator in maintenance clothes at 9:21. She asked him to send her the still image before she reached the elevator bank. The image came through on her phone while she was waiting for the freight elevator, and she stood in the service corridor, looking at a grainy still of a figure in gray maintenance coveralls, stepping out of the elevator with something in his right hand, a bag or a case of some kind, too indistinct to identify precisely. The build was the build of someone she had sat across from in a conference room 3 days ago and watched not look at her while she confronted him with a USB drive. She called Webb back. "Get the federal agent who's been liaising with our legal team on the phone right now, and meet me on 49. The fire was small and deliberate, the specific signature of accelerant applied to a contained area with the intention of destroying targeted material rather than the building. Caldera, whom Webb had called back in, confirmed it within 6 minutes of the suppression team clearing the space. Whoever had been there had known exactly what they were burning and had known how to set a fire that accomplished that specific purpose without drawing emergency response fast enough to interfere. The workstation from the hidden room had already been collected by the federal team 2 days earlier. But there were secondary records, printed documents that had been in the desk drawer, a second external drive that had been taped to the underside of the filing cabinet, financial working papers that Webb had photographed but not removed. Those were what had burned, or most of them. In the corner of the room behind the small refrigerator that had been shoved against the wall when the federal team processed the space, there was a fireproof document sleeve, the kind that architects and engineers kept on job sites for plans that couldn't be replaced. It had survived. Inside, a second copy of the methodology document with both sets of initials and, more significantly, a printed email exchange that the photography hadn't captured because it had been behind the refrigerator throughout the initial search. The exchange was between Voss and an email address that resolved to a Pinnacle Holdings executive domain dated 11 months earlier, and it discussed in the particular oblique language of people who knew they were generating a record the timeline for the Merrill Capital acquisition to complete the expected share price impact on Crestview and what one party would receive when the other's hostile takeover launched in the aftermath. Webb found Grant Waller in the far corner of the space back against the wall, holding an external drive in one hand and what appeared to be a small hammer in the other. He had removed his jacket. He was wearing the same shirt he'd worn to her office 3 days ago, and the expression on his face when he saw her was the expression of a man who had run out of intermediate options. The federal agent who came in behind Webb was already reaching for the drive. Grant let him take it. He looked at Catherine across the ruined evidence of an evening's desperate work and said the only thing left that was true. "I told myself every day for 4 months that I was going to tell you. Every single day." She held his gaze. She didn't offer him the comfort of a response that would make it easier for either of them. What she said instead was the thing she had known since this morning and had been waiting for the right moment to say. Not because the moment needed to be right, but because she needed to be certain she meant it without reservation. "I know. That's the part that's going to be hardest to forget." He was arrested in the building he had helped build on a floor he had managed, carrying evidence he had tried to destroy. Catherine watched the federal agent walk him to the stairwell and stood in the space that smelled of accelerant and burnt paper, and thought about the architecture of trust, how it was built, the same way buildings were built, load by load, with the assumption that each piece was what it appeared to be, and how, like buildings, the failures that mattered were never the ones in the obvious places. They were always in the walls, always in the things that nobody had thought to look at carefully because they had been there for so long. They had stopped appearing as choices and started appearing as structure. James Whitmore appeared in the doorway at 10:45, having ignored her instruction to remain on the lobby level. He looked at the fire suppression residue on the floor, at the open evidence bag holding Grant's phone, and the recovered drive at Catherine, standing in the center of it all with the particular stillness of someone who has passed through the worst of something and come out the other side still standing. "How bad is it?" he asked. "It's the full picture," she said. "Which means it's bad and it's complete and it won't get bigger from here." He nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud of what you did today. My father would be terrified for me." She picked up the fireproof sleeve from the evidence table where Caldera had placed it. "He also would have been right about both things." James looked at the sleeve at the email exchange visible through the clear cover. "The confidence vote is still going to be close." "I know. Sandra has the votes to make it 8-9 against you if she gets to 2 of the uncommitted members before Thursday. Then I'll talk to them first." She handed the sleeve to the federal agent. "But first I need to find Daniel Holt because he's the only person in this entire situation who knew what to do, and did it without a board vote or a compensation structure or a 9-year working relationship telling him it was his job." She found him in the building lobby at 11:15, still in his work clothes, standing near the emergency exit with the particular alertness of someone who had heard the fire alarm from 3 blocks away and come to the building rather than away from it. He looked at her face when she walked toward him and read something in it that made his shoulders drop half an inch, the physical language of relief that was also recognition. "You found more than a fire," he said. "We found all of it." She stopped in front of him. The lobby was full of the residual activity of a building evacuation security personnel, remaining fire unit employees who had been allowed back in and were moving through the space with the half-dazed energy of people processing an event that had interrupted their ordinary Tuesday. "Grant was trying to destroy evidence. We caught him. The methodology documents, the Pinnacle correspondence, it's all there. The federal team has everything they need." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you all right?" It was such a direct question, so unadorned by professional framing that it required a direct answer. "I will be." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced his photo, the Christmas 2021 one, which she had been carrying since the night she found it and had simply never found the right moment to return. She held it out. He took it without looking at it the way people took back something they had been certain they would eventually recover. "Thank you," he said, and she understood that he was not thanking her for the photograph. "Come to my office Thursday morning," she said. "The committee will be ready." She paused, and because the night had cost enough that she could afford to say a true thing without worrying about what framing it required. "You asked the right questions because you couldn't afford not to. I stopped asking the right questions because I thought I could afford to stop. The difference between us, Daniel, isn't who we are. It's what we each decided we were allowed to look at." He held that for a moment. Then, "What made you decide you were allowed to look again?" She looked at the photograph in his hand, the bent corner, the Maine snow, the woman who had not been a ghost to this man, but a promise. "Someone showed me what it looks like when you can't afford the alternative." The public statement went out at midnight, and by 6 in the morning the financial press had turned it into something Catherine barely recognized. Not inaccurate exactly. The facts were the facts, and she had written them plainly enough that distortion would have required effort, but reframed in the particular way that financial journalism reframed events of this kind, which was to lead with the largest number available and work backward toward context. $2.8 billion. Fraud. CFO arrested. CEO cancels merger. The sequence implied a coherent narrative that was technically correct and experientially incomplete, the way a photograph of a fire implied nothing about what had been worth protecting inside the building. Her phone had 43 unread messages by the time she arrived at Merrill Tower at 7:15. She read none of them. Jennifer met her at the elevator with coffee and the morning's agenda, and Catherine walked through her office door and stood at the window for 2 minutes looking at Lake Michigan, which was doing what it always did in late October, running gray and serious under a sky the color of old pewter, indifferent to whatever was happening in the glass towers along its shore. She found this useful. The lake's indifference was not hostile. It was simply scale a reminder that the crisis she was managing, however real its consequences for real people, occupied a specific and finite portion of the universe's available concern. She turned from the window and began working. The morning was a sequence of controlled confrontations. Legal counsel arrived at 7:30 with the cooperation agreement framework that the federal prosecutors had proposed overnight terms that were in the assessment of her outside criminal defense attorney as favorable as the circumstances allowed, which was to say that the terms were not favorable but were survivable. Grant Waller would plead to a single count of securities fraud facilitation, cooperate fully with the prosecution of Voss and the Crestview counterpart, and receive a sentencing recommendation that reflected the breadth and timeliness of his cooperation. He would lose his professional licenses. He would almost certainly not serve prison time, which was a distinction that mattered to his family and would matter to his conscience for the rest of his life in ways that prison time might actually have simplified. She signed the company's cooperation agreement at 8:15. The pen felt the same weight as every other pen she had signed documents with in 17 years, which was the kind of observation that told her she was functioning correctly. Present calibrated, not numb, but not flooded either. At 9 o'clock, Sandra Kemp called and did not leave a message. At 9:30, Sandra Kemp called again and left a message that was 3 minutes long, precisely delivered, and constituted what Catherine, after listening to it twice, characterized to herself as a formal declaration of intent. Sandra was going to the uncommitted board members. She was framing the conversation around governance, which was the right frame for her purposes, because governance was the ground where Catherine was most defensible and also most exposed. She had moved quickly and with limited consultation. And while the outcomes were justifying the speed, the process remained a legitimate target for challenge. Sandra understood that institutional momentum was easier to stop before it consolidated than after, and she was moving before it consolidated. Catherine called James Whitmore. He answered from what sounded like his car, the ambient acoustic of a man who had been moving since before sunrise. "I know," he said before she could explain what she was calling about. "She's already spoken to Marcus Chen and to Patricia Lloyd. I heard from Patricia 20 minutes ago." "What's her position?" "Genuinely uncertain. Patricia understands that the fraud was real and that canceling was the right outcome. She's less certain about whether you had the authority to move as fast as you did without formal board consultation, and Sandra is working that uncertainty." "And Marcus Chen?" "Marcus is going to want a conversation with you directly. He respects results, and he's not unsympathetic, but he spent 18 months on the Crestview Transaction Committee, and he's not going to want to hear from the press that a board member was bypassed on a $2.8 billion decision." Catherine understood the architecture of what was happening. The fraud was not the vulnerability. The fraud was paradoxically her strongest ground, because the evidence was irrefutable and the outcome was correct, and time would make both of those things undeniable. The vulnerability was process, and specifically the space between what she had done and what a more conventionally governed CEO would have done, which was slower and more consultative and would have produced the same outcome several weeks later after the fraud had more time to be concealed and Grant Waller had more time to destroy things. She spent the morning making calls. Marcus Chen first, then the two genuinely uncommitted members whose votes were actually in play. She did not argue with them about process. She acknowledged the legitimate concern directly in the first sentence of each conversation before making the case for outcome. She said, "You are right that I moved without formal consultation, and here is what full formal consultation would have cost in the specific circumstances." Then she walked them through the timeline. The anonymous message warning her to stop the inspection. The fire. Grant in the corner of a burning room with a drive and a hammer. The fireproof sleeve and what was inside it. By noon, she had Marcus Chen. By 2 o'clock, she had one of the uncommitted members. The other remained genuinely uncertain and told her with the careful honesty of someone who respected her enough to tell the truth rather than manage her that they would decide after the full board meeting on Thursday. It was enough, probably enough. The kind of enough that required you to do the intervening work correctly and not make additional mistakes before the vote. Daniel arrived at her office Thursday morning at 8:45, 15 minutes before the committee was scheduled to begin. He was wearing the same newer jacket he had worn in Pilsen with a button-down shirt that was clearly a recent purchase, not expensive, but chosen with the specific intentionality of someone who understood that appearances were a form of communication and wanted to communicate the right things without overstating them. His shoes were polished. His hands, which she noticed because she always noticed hands, were the same hands they had always been. The hands of someone who had built things and broken and rebuilt himself and carried a photograph in his pocket for 3 years, and no amount of new clothing was going to make them look like the hands of a man who had spent his career in offices, which was fine because that was precisely the point. She told him what to expect. Sandra Kemp would be adversarial in the particular way of someone who had a principled objection and the skill to deploy it effectively. James Whitmore would be fair. The two middle members, a woman named Carol Baxter, who ran a logistics company in Indianapolis, and a retired federal judge named Harold Stern, who had joined the board 2 years earlier, would ask substantive questions and expect substantive answers. She told him not to perform expertise he didn't have and not to diminish expertise he did have because the committee would be watching for both. "What are they actually trying to determine?" he asked. "Whether you're someone who will tell us things we need to know or someone who will tell us things we want to know. The first is what we're hiring for. The second is what most organizations accidentally select for over time." He considered that. "How do I demonstrate the difference in a 45-minute interview?" "By saying things that make at least one person in the room uncomfortable. People who tell comfortable truths are easy to find. People who tell uncomfortable ones and don't back down when the discomfort is directed back at them, that's rarer." He nodded once in the way that meant he had filed the information and would use it, and then he went into the conference room and she followed. Sandra opened as expected with credentials. The absence of them, no financial training, no compliance background, no formal education in the disciplines that governed the operations he would be overseeing. She built the case methodically and without personal hostility, which made it more effective than an attack would have been. She was describing a gap, not attacking a person, and the gap was real. Daniel let her finish. "Then, you're right that I don't have those credentials. I'm not applying to replace the people who do. I'm applying to be the person who asks why the numbers don't match what I can physically observe. Why equipment is running in empty buildings. Why a camera covers everything except one specific corridor. Why a pattern that appears in the data every 48 hours for 4 months doesn't generate a question from anyone whose job is asking questions." He paused just long enough to let that settle before continuing. "Your credentialed people missed 14 months of active fraud. I noticed it in 6 weeks because I wasn't invested in not noticing it. That's not a credential, it's a habit. And apparently it's a habit this organization doesn't currently have." Sandra's expression shifted in the way that expressions shifted when a prepared argument encountered a response it hadn't been prepared for, not defeated but recalibrated. And when your habit produces false positives, when you identify something as wrong that turns out to be normal business operations, you don't have the background to interpret correctly. Then I report it, someone with the appropriate background investigates and finds nothing, and we've spent a day on a false lead. That's the cost of asking questions. His voice held the even quality of someone stating a position he had worked out to its conclusion before being asked to defend it. "The cost of not asking them is sitting in this room right now." Harold Stern, who had been listening with the patient attention of someone trained to evaluate testimony, asked the question that mattered most. "Mr. Holt, if you discover something in the course of your work that implicates Ms. Merrill herself, a decision she made an omission, a pattern of behavior that raises genuine concern, what do you do?" Daniel looked at the retired federal judge with the directness of someone who had thought about this question before it was asked. "I report it to this board, same process, same documentation, same standard as anyone else." Even knowing she created this position and that reporting against her could end it. Especially then. He didn't elaborate immediately, letting the answer stand on its own weight before adding what gave it structure. "Because if I protect the person who gave me the opportunity, instead of doing what the opportunity requires, then I've already broken the only thing that makes me worth having in this position. A man who keeps promises when it's convenient isn't keeping promises. He's just doing what's easy and calling it something better." Carol Baxter, who had not spoken yet, asked a question that came from a different angle than the others. Practical, operational, the question of a person who had run a company rather than governed one. "Mr. Holt, you've been disciplined twice in previous positions for what employers characterized as exceeding your role. Both times you were correct. Both times you were penalized for it. Why would this position be different? What makes you believe we won't do to you eventually what those employers did?" He was quiet for a moment that was not hesitation but genuine consideration, the kind of pause that meant he was actually thinking rather than retrieving a prepared answer. "Nothing guarantees you won't. Organizations learn to protect themselves from discomfort the same way individuals do gradually without deciding to, by slowly rewarding the people who don't cause problems and quietly sidelining the ones who do. The only protection against that is a board that decides in advance before the discomfort exists that the discomfort is the point." He looked at Carol directly. "You asked why this position would be different. It's different if you make it different. If you don't, it isn't. And in about 2 years, you'll have another version of what you just spent 3 weeks cleaning up." Carol wrote something on her notepad. Harold Stern was already nodding in the small, economical way of someone registering a point they found valid. Sandra tried one more approach, softer, which was in some ways more dangerous than the direct challenge had been. "Mr. Holt, I want to be clear that no one at this table disputes the value of what you observed or the integrity with which you reported it. What we're trying to determine is whether one successful observation qualifies someone for a permanent institutional role. This board has a responsibility to 3,000 employees and to the clients whose capital we manage. We owe them more than a compelling story." Daniel looked at her for a moment, not unkindly. "You're right that one observation doesn't qualify someone for a permanent role. But I've been making observations like this my whole working life on construction sites and buildings in the spaces that credentialed people walk through without looking at. I've been disciplined for it twice and ignored for it more times than I can count. The observation in this building wasn't an accident. It was the same thing I always do in a place where someone finally decided it was worth investigating instead of suppressing." He paused. "I'm not asking you to bet on a story. I'm asking you to bet on a habit. Stories end. Habits don't." James Whitmore called the vote without additional deliberation. 4 in favor himself, Carol Baxter, Harold Stern, and Catherine. 3 opposed Sandra, and 2 others whose opposition was principled rather than personal, and who said so in the record. The motion carried. Daniel Holt was offered the position of Director of Operational Integrity with a start date of the following Monday, reporting directly to the board with unrestricted access to all physical and infrastructure systems and a support team of 1 financial analyst and 1 systems engineer to help him interpret what he found. After the others had filed out, James stayed. He waited until it was only the 3 of them himself, Catherine and Daniel. And then he told Daniel a story that had nothing to do with Merrill Capital and everything to do with why he had voted the way he had voted. 22 years ago, a manufacturing company, a line supervisor with 2 decades on the floor and no engineering degree, who had reported that safety tolerances on a specific component batch were being falsified in the certification process. The board had thanked him for his concern and deferred to the engineers who had signed off on the components. 14 months later, 3 workers were injured in the field when the components failed. The investigation confirmed that the line supervisor had been right about everything. He had been right and the board had been wrong, and 3 people had carried the physical consequences of that wrongness in their bodies for the rest of their lives. James looked at Daniel with the straightforward attention of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something and had finally found the right person to say it to. "I've voted 100 times since then, on acquisitions and restructurings and executive appointments and governance questions of every kind. And I've tried every time to ask myself whether I was listening to the person with the right credentials or the person with the right information. I still get it wrong sometimes, but I don't get it wrong the same way I got it wrong that day. You gave me the chance to vote differently. That's not a small thing." Daniel looked at the older man. "What happened to him?" "The line supervisor. He found another job, different industry. He did well." James picked up his notepad from the table. "He never knew the investigation vindicated him. We didn't tell him. That was another mistake." He moved toward the door and then stopped and looked back, and what was in his face was the particular expression of a man who had spent 2 decades doing penance for a specific error and had just made one payment toward a debt he knew he couldn't fully retire. Don't let anyone tell you what you did here was luck. Luck doesn't have a methodology. He left. The room was quiet. Catherine looked at Daniel, who was sitting with his hands flat on the conference table in front of him, looking at the empty chairs where the committee had been. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I need to call Sophie and tell her before she hears it from someone else." She smiled, the first real one since the fire unmanaged reaching her eyes before it reached her mouth. "Go call her. Come back Monday and we'll figure out what you actually do on day one." The confidence vote was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the intervening week, Catherine did not campaign for her position, she worked it, which was a different thing. She met with Marcus Chen and walked him through the forensic audit findings that were beginning to produce specific numbers. She met with Patricia Lloyd and acknowledged directly without deflection the governance concerns that were legitimate. She met with the two institutional investors who had called for new leadership and gave them the unvarnished version of the timeline, including the moments where she had acted quickly and the specific reasons that speed had been necessary, and she let them decide what they thought of the reasoning rather than trying to manage their conclusions. She did not meet with Sandra Kemp. Sandra had moved from principled opposition to active organizing, which was her right as a board member, and which Catherine respected in the abstract, the way you respected an opponent who fought cleanly. But there was nothing left to say between them that would change either of their positions, and the meeting would have been performance rather than conversation. And Catherine had decided sometime during the week that followed the fire that she was done with the performances. The ones she had maintained for years because they were professionally necessary, and the ones she had conducted in a leather chair at 3 a.m. for 2 consecutive nights. She would do the work and let the vote go where it went. The night before the confidence vote, she stayed late. Not in the conference room, not testing anyone, just working through the restructured oversight framework that Daniel had begun mapping in his first 3 days. He had already identified 2 things. The first was a minor but systematic discrepancy in the invoicing patterns of 3 contracted maintenance vendors overbilling in small amounts across 18 months that had never been flagged because each individual instance fell below the threshold that triggered automatic review, but which aggregated to something close to $340,000. He had brought the finding to her in a 2-page memo that was in its structure and language unlike any document she had received from a director-level employee before direct spare-free of the hedging qualifications that professional environments trained people to insert as protection against being held responsible for what they'd written. It said what he had found, how he had found it, and what he thought should happen next. Nothing else. The second thing was a question he had brought to her in person, rather than in writing, because he said he wasn't sure it was a problem yet and didn't want to create a paper trail around something he might be misreading. The Denver office's power consumption for the last quarter was 22% higher than the same period the previous year. The headcount in Denver had decreased by 15% over the same period. He had asked his assigned financial analyst to explain the discrepancy and received an explanation that was technically coherent but didn't resolve the underlying math. He wasn't certain it was fraud. He was certain that something physical in that office didn't correspond to what the numbers said, and he wanted her to know he was looking at it before he went further. She told him to keep looking. He nodded and went back to his work. She stood at her window the night before the vote with the restructured framework in her hand, and thought about what her father had built in this building and what had nearly been destroyed in it and what was being rebuilt now slowly and without ceremony, one accurate question at a time. The Crestview transaction was gone. Grant was gone. Voss would spend years in federal court. The share price had recovered 11 of the 31 points it had lost in the week after the cancellation announcement, which her investment banking advisors characterized as faster than typical for a fraud disclosure event, attributable in part to the perception that Merrill Capital had gotten ahead of the problem rather than being caught by it. She thought about what it had taken to get ahead of it. A man who worked nights in a building where he was invisible by design, doing the one thing that all of the building's credentialed, compensated, professionally socialized inhabitants had failed to do consistently, which was to look at what was actually in front of him and ask what it meant. She thought about Claire Holt in a Maine December driving toward a man who couldn't answer the phone on a road that was worse than she knew. She thought about the specific shape of the grief that had produced a promise, and about the specific kind of person that promise had produced, not softened by tragedy into something passive and careful, but sharpened by it into someone who understood that the cost of not noticing was not abstract and not recoverable. Her phone vibrated. Not a call, a text from a number she had added to her contacts 3 weeks ago and had texted with perhaps a dozen times, mostly logistics. Sophie drew something at school today. She wants to bring it to you Friday if that's okay. She typed back, "Tell her Friday is good. Tell her I'll have the good colored pencils ready in case she wants to add anything." A pause of 30 seconds and then, "She says she already finished it, but she'll bring her own pencils just in case. Also, she says to tell you good luck tomorrow." Catherine looked at that for a moment. Then she set her phone face up on the desk, which was not her habit, which was a small departure from 17 years of always keeping the screen private, and went back to the restructured framework. The confidence vote went 11-6 in her favor. It was not the margin she would have designed if she were designing it, but it was the margin the situation had produced, and she had learned in the past month a renewed respect for accepting what situations actually produced rather than the version you had prepared for. Sandra voted against and did so on the record with a formal dissent that Catherine read once and then set aside. The dissent was thorough and professionally argued and would probably look prescient if Catherine made further decisions that Sandra characterized as ungoverned, and it would look exactly like what it was, a principled minority position that the evidence had failed to support, if she didn't. Sandra resigned from the board 4 weeks later. She did it quietly, without the public statement that would have given her opposition more reach, which told Catherine something about Sandra's fundamental character that the opposition itself hadn't fully conveyed. She fought cleanly, and she left cleanly, and the resignation was in its own way a form of respect, the acknowledgement that the outcome had been legitimate even if she continued to dispute the process. The 3 additional suspects identified through Grant's cooperation, the 2 accounting employees and the Crestview deputy CFO Randall Pierce, were prosecuted across the following year. Voss received 7 years. Grant received a suspended sentence, 3 years of probation, and the permanent revocation of his professional licenses. He called Catherine once in the spring, 8 months after the arrest. She took the call. He said what he needed to say, which was not complicated. He was sorry he knew that wasn't sufficient, and he wanted her to know that what she had built in the aftermath was the right response to what he had failed to prevent. She thanked him. She did not offer him anything further because there was nothing further she had to offer, and he hadn't called expecting it. Pierce received 4 years. The 2 accounting employees received lighter sentences in recognition of their cooperation and the significantly narrower scope of their involvement. Her brother called in February. Not a text, an actual call, which was unusual enough that she answered it before the second ring. Thomas Jr. was 51 years old and had spent the previous 4 months, she suspected, in a kind of reckoning that she had no direct visibility into, but whose outlines she could infer from the fact that he was calling at all. The conversation was brief and honest, in the specific, costly way of conversations between people who have stopped pretending the difficulty between them is smaller than it is. He knew she had seen the federal investigation report. He knew she understood what his conversations with Voss had represented, not criminal complicity, but a kind of willing blindness to where those conversations were heading, because he had wanted a specific outcome badly enough to not look carefully at the machinery producing it. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked if she was willing to talk, not to resolve anything immediately, but to talk. She said yes. They made a time for the following month and kept it. And what happened in that conversation was not reconciliation exactly, but the beginning of something that might eventually become it, which was the most that was possible and more than she had expected. She told Daniel about it on one of their Friday afternoon walks, the informal end-of-week circuit through the building's lower floors that had become habit over the first 3 months of his role. Not a meeting, not a reporting structure, just 2 people in the same building at the end of a week who had found that the easiest way to think out loud was to move while doing it. He listened without interrupting, which was his characteristic mode of receiving information he was still processing. "Does it help?" he asked. knowing he wasn't actively working against you, just not looking carefully enough to see what he was adjacent to. It helps differently than I expected. I thought it would make it simpler. It makes it more complicated but more human. She stopped at a window that looked north away from the lake toward the neighborhoods that spread out from downtown Chicago into the grid of the city's actual residential life. He wanted me to fail badly enough that he was willing to stand near people who were building the mechanisms of that failure. But he didn't build them. And when they started to feel wrong, he called and asked me about the merger. And she paused. That call was the one that made me look at the Voss Web connection. He didn't know he was helping me. He was just reaching out because something felt off, and he called the one person who would do something with the feeling. Daniel looked at the same view. People tell you things they don't know they're telling you all the time. That's the whole job, isn't it? The listening underneath the talking. He glanced at her sideways, in the particular way of someone who had registered something they found worth noting. That's the whole job. The Denver situation resolved 3 weeks later. Not fraud, but a significant billing irregularity in their facilities. Management contract, a vendor charging for HVAC system upgrades that had been partially completed and then quietly deprioritized without a corresponding adjustment to invoices. Not criminal, but not the kind of thing that should have run unchallenged for 8 months. The Denver office manager had noticed it and raised it internally and been told by the regional operations lead to let it work through the contract cycle. Daniel found it by looking at the power consumption numbers and following the physical chain backward from equipment that wasn't performing at the level the billing indicated it had been upgraded to perform. The board received his finding in the same format as the first one, direct spare, no hedging. Carol Baxter told Catherine afterward that she had read it twice because she kept expecting to find something she'd missed, some qualification or caveat that would make it less clear than it was, and had concluded that clarity was simply how he wrote. Harold Stern said it was the most useful board document he had received since joining. The contract was renegotiated. The regional operations lead was counseled. The Denver office manager received a written acknowledgement that her concern had been correct and should have been acted on when she first raised it, which was a small thing in the accounting of institutional behavior and a large thing in the accounting of what it meant to be someone who noticed something and said something and was told it wasn't her concern. Sophie came to the building on a Friday afternoon in late November when the lake outside was the color of old iron, and the first serious cold of the season had settled over the city with the particular finality of winter making its commitment. She arrived with her father at 4:30, wearing a red coat that had been recently purchased and a backpack that had a small, painted wooden bird hanging from the zipper, which Daniel told Catherine had been a gift from a teacher who knew Sophie's mother had loved birds. Sophie had been to the building twice before during school visits that Daniel had arranged with Jennifer, not the executive floors, but the lobby and the lower floors where Daniel's work mostly happened, where she had declared the freight elevator, the Sirius elevator, and the lobby security desk, the place where they decide who matters, which had made the security guard on duty laugh in a way that suggested he found this accurate. She understood in the particular way that children understood the essential truth of things. They lacked the vocabulary to frame precisely that her father's work here was different from what it had been before, that the building meant something to him, now that it hadn't meant when he was pushing a cart through it at 3 in the morning. She came into Catherine's office with the confidence of someone who had been there before and found it less intimidating than its reputation suggested. She looked around at the window, at the lake, at the desk, at the photograph of Thomas Merrill Sr. that sat on the credenza behind the desk alongside the framed print that Catherine's assistant had ordered from a local artist, a Chicago winter street scene that was the only thing on the walls that hadn't been there since Catherine's father's time. Then Sophie produced from her backpack a piece of construction paper that had been protected in a rigid folder, clearly with adult assistance in the protective measures if not in the artwork itself. She held it up. The building was there, tall and specific, the windows rendered in yellow crayon that caught the light in a way that made them look warm rather than corporate, the kind of light you saw in a building from outside at night when the floors were occupied and working. At the base of the building, 2 figures. One taller in what was recognizably a dark jacket. One shorter in work clothes. They were standing side by side looking up at the building together, and the posture of both figures communicated something that was different from authority or ownership. Something closer to responsibility the stance of people who had agreed to keep watching. In the upper left corner of the drawing, small and slightly apart from the building and the two figures, there was a third figure, smaller than the others, higher than the roofline, drawn with the particular care that Sophie had given to things she considered important. A woman clearly standing on what might have been a cloud or might have been nothing at all, something that supported her without being named, and looking down at the two figures below with an expression that in a child's drawing was conveyed entirely through the angle of the face and the set of lines that stood for a smile. Sophie explained without being asked, "That's Mommy. She's watching because that's what she does. Ba says she's always somewhere watching." She pointed to the two figures at the base. "That's you and Ba. You're both looking up at the building because you both make sure it's okay." She pointed to the third figure. "Mommy's looking at you both because she wants to make sure you're okay. That's how it works. Everybody watches somebody." Catherine held the drawing and looked at it for a long time. Long enough that Sophie, who was patient for an 8-year-old but not infinitely so, eventually asked, "Do you like it?" "I like it very much." She looked up from the paper and found Daniel standing in the doorway where he had been since Sophie came in, and what was in his face was the expression of a man watching his daughter do something that he had not asked her to do and could not have anticipated, and that had produced in him the specific emotion of someone whose grief and his promise and his love had all arrived at the same place simultaneously. He was not crying. He was something quieter than crying and more complete. Catherine looked back at Sophie. "Can I tell you something?" Sophie nodded with the gravity of someone prepared to receive important information. "Your dad notices things that other people walk past. He noticed something in this building that everyone else was too busy to see, and because he noticed it, a lot of people were protected from something bad." She held the drawing carefully by the edges. "The reason he notices things, the real reason underneath all the other reasons, is because of your mom. Because she made him understand that the cost of not paying attention is too high. That's not a sad thing, even though it started with something sad. It's actually the most important thing I've learned from anyone in a long time." Sophie considered this with the focused seriousness of someone running a complex calculation. "Ba says promises are the most important thing, more important than being smart or being in charge." "Your dad is right." "Are you going to keep your promise?" Sophie asked. And it was not the question of a child testing an adult. It was a genuine inquiry, direct and without guile, the kind of question that only people who had not yet learned to protect themselves from the answers asked. Catherine thought about the vote, about the canceled merger, about Grant in a burning room with a drive and a hammer, about the 11-6 and the ongoing Denver investigation, and the restructured oversight framework and the restructured way she looked at the people she trusted, which was no longer as a decision made once and closed, but as a practice maintained continuously, requiring the same attention she was trying to build into the institution itself. She thought about Thomas Merrill Sr. telling her that the company was only worth keeping if you could look at it clearly, which she was finally doing, which was harder than she had expected and more important than she had understood. "I'm going to keep trying," she said, "which is what a real promise looks like. Not a guarantee, an intention you renew every day." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Then, can I see the Sirius elevator before we go?" Daniel laughed, a real one from the chest, the laugh of a man who had spent 3 years being carefully measured in his emotional expression and had found in the ordinary request of an 8-year-old who wanted to ride a freight elevator something that simply struck him as funny. Catherine found herself laughing too, which was not something she had expected to do at 4:45 on a Thursday in her office, with the November lake gray outside the window and 100 unread messages on her phone and a board confidence vote 12 days behind her and a Denver investigation in progress. She walked them to the freight elevator herself. Sophie pressed the button. The elevator arrived with its specific heavy mechanical dignity, and Sophie stepped in and pressed the lobby button with the ceremonial intentionality of someone performing a procedure that mattered, and they rode down together in the particular silence of an elevator carrying 3 people, each of whom understood something about what the building around them had cost and what it was worth. In the lobby, Sophie took her father's hand, not the grip of a frightened child, but the easy, habitual connection of someone who had decided some time ago that this was where her hand went when they were in the world together. She looked at the security desk and then back at Catherine. "Everybody who works here, do they know what Ba does?" "They're learning." "Good." She appeared to consider this sufficient. "We're going to get tacos. Do you want to come?" Catherine looked at Daniel, who was watching her with the particular expression he used when he was letting a situation develop without directing it. The same expression she had read in the conference room. Reflection on 2 consecutive nights. The expression of someone who noticed everything and moved at the pace that honesty required. He did not add anything to his daughter's invitation or walk it back. He simply waited to see what she would do with it. "I would like that," Catherine said. They went out through the lobby into the November cold of a Chicago evening, the lake invisible from the street, but present in the quality of the air, that mineral edge that Chicagoans learned to read, the way sailors read weather, the specific announcement of a city built at the edge of something that did not bend to institutional concerns. The street was full of people finishing their workdays, moving with the forward purpose of people who had somewhere to be, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary Thursday evening, in a city that ran on exactly this, on people doing their work and going home and feeding their children and keeping or failing to keep the promises that organized their lives. Sophie walked between them, talking about something that had happened in math class, something involving fractions that she had initially found impossible and then suddenly understood in a way that she wanted to explain in full detail to 2 adults who were both, for different reasons, willing to hear about fractions for as long as she wanted to discuss them. Daniel listened to his daughter and looked at the city around him with the same attention he gave everything. Steady, unhurried, the practiced attention of someone who had made a promise about what paying attention required and had spent 3 years learning what that promise actually cost, and had decided on evidence that it was worth the cost. The building stood behind them, its windows carrying the last of the afternoon light, its systems running at the loads they were supposed to run at, its floors occupied by people doing their work with the imperfect, ongoing, correctable earnestness of people inside an institution that had recently been reminded what institutions were for. It would not be the last problem. The Denver situation would resolve and something else would surface, because that was the nature of organizations built by people who were capable of both integrity and its absence, sometimes simultaneously. There would be more votes, more pressure, more moments where the easier path presented itself as the reasonable path. The work was not a project with a completion date. It was a practice with a renewal requirement. But tonight, there were tacos in Pilsen, and an 8-year-old who wanted to explain fractions, and a man who had covered a stranger with his jacket because he had promised he would notice, and a woman who had finally learned the difference between trusting people and watching them clearly. And that was sufficient for a November Thursday in Chicago, which was a city that understood in its bones and its winters and its particular lake-edged light. That sufficient was sometimes the most honest word for enough.